Morgan Freeman was about to do something that would shock the world. The man whose voice had narrated the story of God himself was preparing to walk away from faith forever. Not quietly, not privately, but in a way that would send shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. What nobody knew was that for the past 6 months, the legendary actor had been living a secret torment that was eating him alive from the inside. The same voice that had brought comfort to millions through spiritual documentaries was now filled with doubt, anger, and a devastating emptiness that threatened to destroy everything he once believed. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Morgan made the decision that would have changed everything. He had already written the letter. 23 pages of raw, unfiltered truth about his crisis of faith, his anger at God, and his decision to publicly renounce everything he had ever said about spirituality and divine purpose. The letter was addressed to his publicist with instructions to release it to every major news outlet. In it, he revealed the personal tragedies that had shattered his worldview, the unanswered prayers that had left him feeling abandoned, and his conclusion that everything he had believed about God's love and protection was nothing more than a beautiful lie. The world would have been stunned. Here was Morgan Freeman, the man who had played God on screen, who had narrated countless documentaries about faith and miracles, who had become America's spiritual grandfather figure, announcing that it was all meaningless. The headlines would have been devastating. Morgan Freeman loses faith, the voice of God goes silent, Hollywood's spiritual icon walks away. But what makes this story extraordinary is that the letter was never sent. Because on that same Tuesday morning, exactly 4 hours before Morgan was scheduled to meet with his publicist, something happened that changed everything. He encountered a homeless man outside a coffee shop in downtown Los Angeles. Nothing unusual about that in a city where such encounters happen daily. But this wasn't just any homeless man, and this wasn't just any conversation. In less than 10 minutes, this stranger would speak 5 simple words that would not only save Morgan's faith but transform his entire understanding of how God works in the world. 5 words so powerful, so perfectly timed, so impossible to explain away, that Morgan would later call it the most profound miracle of his life. The homeless man had no idea who Morgan Freeman was. He couldn't have known about the letter, about the planned announcement, about the spiritual crisis that had been consuming one of America's most beloved actors. He had no way of knowing that Morgan was exactly 4 hours away from making a decision that would have rocked the entertainment industry and disappointed millions of fans worldwide. Yet somehow, in a way that defies all logical explanation, this stranger spoke the exact words that Morgan's broken heart needed to hear. What were those 5 words? Why did they have such incredible power? How did a man with nothing to his name become the instrument of salvation for someone who seemed to have everything? And what was it about Morgan's secret struggle that had brought him to such a desperate place? The answers to these questions reveal a story so remarkable, so perfectly orchestrated, that even the most skeptical person would have to wonder if there really are forces at work in this universe that we don't fully understand. Morgan Freeman himself admits that if someone had told him this story 6 months earlier, he would have been politely skeptical. The man who had spent decades exploring questions of faith and spirituality thought he understood how divine intervention worked. He thought miraculous encounters happened to other people, in other places, during other times. He never imagined that his own salvation would come through a chance meeting with a homeless stranger on a busy Los Angeles street corner. But sometimes, the most profound truths come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The letter that could have changed everything still sits in Morgan's desk drawer, unread by anyone except himself. He keeps it as a reminder of how close he came to making the biggest mistake of his life. But more importantly, he keeps it as a testament to the power of divine timing and the mysterious ways that hope can find us even in our darkest moments. What happened on that Tuesday morning didn't just save his faith. It gave him a completely new understanding of how God speaks to his children, especially when they need him most. This is the story of those 5 words, the broken man who needed to hear them, and the unlikely messenger who delivered them at exactly the right moment. It's a story about the thin line between despair and hope, about the way divine love can reach us through the most unexpected channels, and about how sometimes our greatest spiritual breakthroughs come disguised as ordinary human encounters. But most of all, it's a story about why Morgan Freeman now believes more deeply than ever that there are no coincidences, only carefully orchestrated moments of grace that arrive precisely when we need them most. To understand why Morgan Freeman was moments away from destroying his spiritual legacy, you have to know what brought him to that devastating breaking point. For 70 years, faith had been his anchor, his compass, his source of strength through every challenge life had thrown at him. From his childhood in Mississippi to his rise in Hollywood, Morgan had always believed that God had a plan, that suffering served a purpose, and that prayers were heard even when they seemed unanswered. But in the span of 18 months, everything he thought he knew about divine love and protection would be systematically shattered. It started with his granddaughter's diagnosis. Edina Hines, whom Morgan had raised as his own daughter, was battling addiction and mental health struggles that seemed to get worse despite every intervention, every treatment program, every desperate prayer Morgan offered on her behalf. Night after night, he would kneel beside his bed, pleading with God to heal the beautiful young woman who had brought such joy to his life. He promised everything he had, his career, his wealth, his remaining years, if only God would restore her mind and free her from the demons that were destroying her. But the prayers seemed to bounce off an empty sky. Edina's condition deteriorated, and Morgan watched helplessly as the bright, creative spirit he had nurtured slowly disappeared behind a wall of mental illness and substance abuse. The man who had spent decades telling stories about divine miracles couldn't understand why his own desperate pleas for one seemed to fall on deaf ears. Then came the phone call that would begin his spiritual unraveling. Edina had been found dead, murdered in a senseless act of violence that made national headlines and shattered Morgan's world completely. The grief was unbearable, but what followed was even worse. Morgan found himself questioning everything he had ever believed about God's protection, about divine justice, about the very nature of love itself. How could a loving God allow such a beautiful soul to suffer so much and die so young? Where was the divine intervention when Edina needed it most? Why had decades of faithful service, charitable giving, and sincere worship seemingly counted for nothing when it mattered most? As if losing Edina wasn't devastating enough, Morgan's own health began to fail in ways that seemed almost cruelly ironic. The voice that had become synonymous with wisdom and spiritual authority started to betray him. He developed a rare neurological condition that affected his speech, making it increasingly difficult to do the work that had defined his entire adult life. The doctors called it a progressive disorder with no cure, no treatment, no hope for improvement. Morgan couldn't help but see it as the final insult from a God who seemed determined to strip away everything that mattered to him. But the cruelest blow came when Morgan discovered that people were using his spiritual crisis as entertainment. Tabloid reporters were paying hospital staff for information about his condition. Social media was filled with speculation about his health, his faith, and his future. The same voice that had brought comfort to millions was now the subject of gossip and sensationalized headlines. Morgan felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly abandoned by both God and humanity. The sanctuary of his private faith had become a public spectacle, and he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being punished for ever believing in divine love in the first place. What nobody knew was that Morgan had been keeping a journal throughout this entire ordeal, documenting his prayers, his doubts, and his growing anger at God. Page after page of raw, unfiltered honesty about his spiritual journey from faith to fury. He wrote about the nights when he would rage at the heavens, demanding answers that never came. He documented his attempts to find meaning in suffering, to trust in divine timing, to hold on to hope when everything seemed hopeless. But eventually, the journal entries became shorter, darker, more desperate, until the final entry simply read, "I'm done. There's nothing left to believe in." That journal would become the foundation for the letter he planned to release to the world. Morgan had decided that if God wasn't going to answer his prayers, he would at least use his platform to spare others the pain of false hope. He would tell the truth about unanswered prayers, about divine silence, about the harsh reality that sometimes faith isn't enough to protect the people we love. He convinced himself that it would be an act of mercy, a way to free people from the burden of believing in a God who either couldn't or wouldn't intervene when it mattered most. The night before he planned to send the letter, Morgan sat in his study, rereading those 23 pages of spiritual devastation. He felt a strange sense of peace about his decision, as if finally admitting defeat was somehow liberating. He had spent months trying to rebuild his faith, searching for signs, looking for reasons to believe, but every attempt had led to deeper disappointment. The letter felt like the only honest response to a God who had seemingly abandoned him when he needed divine love most. What Morgan didn't know was that his story was about to take a turn so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that it would force him to reconsider everything he thought he understood about how God works in the world. In less than 12 hours, a stranger would speak 5 words that would reveal the hidden purpose behind all of his suffering and transform his understanding of divine love forever. But first, he had to make it through the longest night of his life, clutching that letter and wondering if he was about to make the right decision or the biggest mistake of his spiritual journey. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, matching the emptiness in Morgan's heart perfectly. He had barely slept, spending the night clutching that 23-page letter like a weapon he was finally ready to use. At 9 a.m., he had an appointment with his publicist. By 9:30 a.m., the most shocking confession in Hollywood history would be racing across every news outlet in America. Morgan Freeman, the voice of God himself, was about to tell the world that faith was a lie. But first, he needed coffee. One last quiet moment before he destroyed everything he had built over 7 decades. Morgan drove to a small cafe in downtown Los Angeles, a place where he could sit anonymously and prepare for what was about to happen. His hands trembled as he parked the car, not from his neurological condition, but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. There would be no going back after this morning. Outside the cafe, something caught his attention. A homeless man was sitting on the sidewalk, not begging or holding a sign, just sitting quietly with his eyes closed as if he was praying. Morgan had walked past hundreds of homeless people in his life, usually offering money or a kind word, but today he felt too broken to help anyone else. He couldn't save his granddaughter, he couldn't heal his own voice, he certainly couldn't fix the stranger's problems. But as Morgan approached the cafe entrance, the homeless man opened his eyes and looked directly at him. Not with recognition, not with the starstruck expression Morgan was used to seeing, but with something else entirely. It was a look of knowing, as if this stranger could see straight through to Morgan's shattered soul. For a moment, Morgan felt completely exposed, as if this man somehow knew about the letter in his pocket, about the appointment in 2 hours, about the spiritual devastation that was consuming him. The homeless man was probably in his 60s, with weathered hands and kind eyes that seemed far too peaceful for someone living on the streets. His clothes were clean but worn, and there was a small, tattered Bible beside him on the concrete. Something about his presence felt different, almost otherworldly, as if he existed in a state of calm that defied his circumstances. Morgan found himself slowing down, unable to look away from this stranger's penetrating gaze. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" the homeless man said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to cut through the cold October air. Morgan glanced around at the gray sky, the busy traffic, the urban chaos surrounding them, and almost laughed at the absurdity of the comment. Beautiful? Nothing about this morning felt beautiful. Nothing about anything felt beautiful anymore. But something in the man's tone made Morgan pause instead of walking away. "I suppose it could be," Morgan replied, surprised by his own willingness to engage. He should be focused on preparing for his meeting, on steeling himself for the media storm that was about to erupt, on saying goodbye to the faith that had once defined him. Instead, he found himself drawn into conversation with a stranger who seemed to radiate the very peace that had been missing from Morgan's life for months. The homeless man smiled, an expression so genuine and joyful that it seemed impossible given his circumstances. "Sometimes we can't see the beauty until we're ready to receive it," he said, patting the sidewalk beside him in a gentle invitation. "Would you like to sit for a moment? You look like a man carrying a heavy burden." Morgan felt his heart stop. How could this stranger possibly know? How could someone who had never met him, who lived on the streets with nothing but a worn Bible, see so clearly into his spiritual crisis? For a moment, Morgan considered walking away, getting his coffee, and proceeding with his plan to destroy his faith publicly. But something about this man's presence felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning soul. Against every rational thought in his head, Morgan Freeman sat down on the cold sidewalk next to a homeless stranger, 2 hours away from the most devastating announcement of his career. He had no idea that he was about to hear 5 words that would change everything he thought he knew about divine timing, spiritual rescue, and the mysterious ways that God sends exactly the right message through exactly the right messenger at exactly the right moment. Sitting on that cold sidewalk, Morgan felt like he was in a dream. Here he was, one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, having a conversation with a homeless stranger while carrying a letter that would destroy his entire spiritual legacy. The homeless man introduced himself simply as Samuel, and somehow, being next to him felt like the first peaceful moment Morgan had experienced in months. "You know," Samuel said, looking up at the gray sky, "I used to be angry at God too." Morgan's blood went cold. He hadn't mentioned God, hadn't talked about faith, hadn't given any indication of his spiritual struggle. Yet somehow, this stranger had cut straight to the heart of his crisis with surgical precision. "How did you know?" Morgan whispered, his voice barely audible above the traffic noise. Samuel smiled gently. "When you've been broken the way I have, you recognize it in others. The way you're sitting, the weight in your shoulders, the look in your eyes, that's the posture of a man wrestling with heaven." Morgan felt tears threatening to form. For months, he had hidden his spiritual crisis from everyone: his family, his friends, his colleagues. Yet this homeless man had seen through his facade in minutes. "I lost everything that mattered to me," Morgan found himself saying, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "My granddaughter, my health, my voice, my faith. I prayed harder than I've ever prayed for anything, and God was silent. Completely silent." Samuel nodded knowingly, as if he had heard this story 1,000 times before. "And now you're wondering if he was ever there at all." The accuracy of Samuel's observation hit Morgan like a physical blow. "Exactly," he whispered. "I'm tired of believing in a God who doesn't show up when his children need him most. I'm tired of having faith in someone who seems to enjoy watching us suffer." Morgan pulled the letter from his pocket, his hands shaking. "In 1 hour, I'm going to tell the world that faith is a lie. That God either doesn't exist or doesn't care." Samuel looked at the letter with an expression of infinite sadness. "That's a heavy decision, brother. One that can't be undone once it's out there." He paused, studying Morgan's face. "But before you do that, can I ask you something? In all your prayers for your granddaughter, what exactly were you asking God to do?" Morgan felt confused by the question. "To heal her, to save her, to protect her. What else would I pray for? And when those prayers seemed unanswered, did you consider that maybe God was saying yes to something bigger than what you could see?" Samuel's voice was gentle but penetrating. Morgan felt a flash of anger. This was exactly the kind of spiritual platitude that had driven him away from faith in the first place. Bigger than saving an innocent girl's life? Bigger than protecting someone I loved more than my own life? What could possibly be bigger than that? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped together as if he was praying. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Morgan lean in closer. "Sometimes God's greatest mercy looks like his greatest cruelty. Sometimes he allows our hearts to break completely so they can heal in a way that's strong enough to carry other people's pain." The words hit Morgan like lightning. Something about the way Samuel said it, the timing, the impossible wisdom coming from someone who seemed to have nothing, made Morgan's anger begin to crack. "You're saying God let my granddaughter die so I could help other people?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm saying maybe your granddaughter's story isn't over yet," Samuel replied, his eyes blazing with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to Morgan's soul. "Maybe her life, and your pain, are about to become the key that unlocks hope for thousands of people who have given up on God the same way you have." Samuel leaned closer, and Morgan could see tears forming in the homeless man's eyes. "What if God has been preparing you for the most important role of your life, and you're about to walk away from it 60 minutes before your cue?" Morgan felt his world shifting beneath him. The letter in his hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Samuel looked at him with such compassion, such certainty, that Morgan found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about divine timing and spiritual purpose. But he still didn't understand what Samuel was really trying to tell him. That's when Samuel reached over and gently took Morgan's hands in his own. Looking directly into the eyes of the man who had once played God on screen, this homeless stranger was about to speak 5 words that would change everything. 5 words that would reveal the hidden purpose behind all of Morgan's suffering and transform his understanding of how God works in the world forever. Time seemed to stop as Samuel held Morgan's trembling hands on that cold sidewalk. The traffic noise faded into silence. The bustling city around them disappeared. In that moment, there was only a broken man holding a letter that would destroy his faith and a homeless stranger who somehow carried the presence of heaven itself. Samuel looked directly into Morgan's eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a power that seemed to come from beyond this world. "She's still speaking through you." 5 simple words. But the moment they left Samuel's lips, Morgan felt like he had been struck by lightning. The letter fell from his hands onto the concrete as every cell in his body recognized the truth he had been too broken to see. Edina wasn't gone. Her voice, her spirit, her purpose, it was all still alive, waiting to be expressed through the man who had loved her most. Morgan's hands flew to his face as the tears came in torrents. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of recognition, of understanding, of a divine revelation so powerful it shattered every wall of anger and doubt he had built around his heart. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Oh my God, she's still here." Samuel squeezed Morgan's hands gently. "She never left, brother. Her story didn't end with her death. It transformed into something bigger. Every word you speak about hope, every story you tell about redemption, every time you use your voice to heal someone else's broken heart, that's her legacy living on through you." Morgan looked up at Samuel through his tears, seeing not just a homeless man anymore, but a messenger sent at the exact moment when he needed divine intervention most. "The neurological condition," Morgan said suddenly, understanding flooding through him like a dam breaking. "It's not God taking away my voice. It's Him preparing me to use it differently." Samuel nodded, his eyes shining with joy at Morgan's breakthrough. "Your voice was always meant for more than entertainment. It was meant to be a lifeline for people drowning in the same despair you've been fighting." Morgan thought about all the sleepless nights when he had raged at God for allowing Edina to suffer, for letting her die so young, for taking away the person who brought such light into his world. Now he saw it differently. Edina's battle with mental illness, her struggles with addiction, her tragic death, it hadn't been meaningless suffering. It had been preparing Morgan to speak with authentic authority about pain, about loss, about the possibility of hope in the darkest moments. "The letter," Morgan said, looking down at the 23 pages scattered on the sidewalk. "I was about to tell the world that faith is a lie." Samuel helped him gather the pages, handling them with the gentleness of someone touching sacred things. "Instead, you're going to tell them that faith is the only thing that makes sense of senseless tragedy. You're going to use Edina's story to save other people's granddaughters, other people's children, other people's hope." The revelation hit Morgan like a physical force. Every unanswered prayer hadn't been divine silence. It had been divine preparation. God hadn't abandoned him during his darkest hours. He had been equipping him with the experiential knowledge necessary to guide others through their own valleys of despair. Edina's death wasn't the end of her impact on the world. It was the beginning of her legacy speaking through the voice that had loved her most. Morgan looked at his watch. 37 minutes until his appointment with the publicist. 37 minutes until he was supposed to destroy everything he had ever believed about divine love and purpose. But now, sitting on a sidewalk with a homeless prophet who had spoken 5 words that changed everything, Morgan realized he had a completely different story to tell. "I know what I have to do now," Morgan said, standing up and carefully folding the letter before putting it back in his pocket. Not to send it, but to keep it as a reminder of how close he had come to missing the most important calling of his life. Samuel stood up beside him, and for the first time, Morgan noticed that despite having nothing material to his name, this man radiated a peace and joy that no amount of wealth or success had ever given Morgan. "Thank you," Morgan said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for seeing what I couldn't see, for saying what I needed to hear, for being exactly where God needed you to be at exactly the right moment." Samuel smiled, that same knowing expression that had first caught Morgan's attention. "I wasn't here by accident, brother. Neither were you." This whole conversation was orchestrated by someone who loves you more than you can imagine. As Samuel walked away, disappearing into the morning crowd as mysteriously as he had appeared, Morgan stood on that sidewalk completely transformed. The man who had been minutes away from publicly renouncing his faith now understood that everything he had suffered, Edina's death, his health struggles, his spiritual crisis, had been preparing him for the most important work of his life. He was about to become the voice of hope for everyone who had ever felt abandoned by God, and Edina's legacy was going to live on through every person he helped find their way back to faith. Morgan walked into his publicist's office 30 minutes later, a completely different man. The same building, the same appointment, but instead of carrying a letter that would destroy his faith, he carried a new understanding that would transform his entire purpose. His publicist, Jennifer, noticed the change immediately. "Morgan, you look different. Are you all right? You seemed so determined this morning about making that announcement." "I was," Morgan replied, sitting down with a calmness that surprised even himself. "But something extraordinary happened on the way here. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about God's plan for my life." He pulled out the letter, but instead of handing it to Jennifer, he held it like a sacred relic. This letter was going to be my declaration of war against faith. Instead, it's become my reminder of how close I came to missing my true calling. Jennifer leaned forward, confused. "I don't understand. 2 hours ago you were ready to tell the world that God had abandoned you. What could possibly have changed in such a short time?" Morgan smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. "I met a homeless man named Samuel who spoke 5 words that saved my soul. She's still speaking through you." He was talking about Edina. The transformation in Morgan was so complete that Jennifer struggled to process it. This was the same man who had called her in tears just days earlier, demanding to schedule this meeting so he could publicly renounce everything he had ever believed about divine love. Now he sat before her radiating a peace that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human understanding. "I've been looking at everything wrong," Morgan continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Edina's death, my illness, my spiritual crisis, I thought they were punishments from a God who had stopped caring. But they were preparation for the most important work of my life. God didn't take my voice away. He's been teaching me how to use it to heal other people's broken hearts." Morgan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below with new eyes. "I'm going to tell Edina's story, Jennifer. Not as a tragedy that proves God's absence, but as a testament to how divine love can transform even the deepest pain into purpose. I'm going to become the voice for everyone who thinks God has abandoned them, everyone who's lost someone they love, everyone who's ready to give up on faith." Jennifer watched in amazement as Morgan outlined his new vision. Instead of destroying his spiritual legacy, he was going to build it into something more powerful than ever before. He talked about starting a foundation in Edina's name, about using his platform to address mental health and addiction, about creating content that would give hope to people in their darkest moments. "The neurological condition that's affecting my speech," Morgan said, turning back to Jennifer with tears in his eyes, "I used to see it as God's final cruelty. Now I understand it's his way of slowing me down, making me more intentional with every word I speak. When you know your voice might not last forever, you become very careful about how you use it." The man who had walked into that office planning to destroy his faith walked out with a mission that would define the rest of his life. Edina's legacy wasn't ending with her death, it was just beginning. And Samuel's 5 words had given Morgan the key to unlock a purpose he never knew he was meant to fulfill. The broken voice of a grieving grandfather was about to become the healing voice for millions of people who had lost their way. As Morgan left the building, he realized that his encounter with Samuel hadn't just saved his faith, it had revealed the reason his faith had been tested so severely in the first place. God hadn't been absent during his darkest hours. He had been preparing Morgan for the most important role of his life, becoming a voice of hope for the hopeless, speaking life into the spiritually dead, and proving that even the deepest wounds can become the source of the most powerful healing. 6 months after that life-changing encounter on a Los Angeles sidewalk, Morgan Freeman's transformation had sent ripples across the world in ways no one could have predicted. The man who almost destroyed his faith publicly had instead become one of the most powerful voices for spiritual hope in modern times. The Adina Hines Foundation was helping thousands of families navigate mental health crises, and Morgan's authentic testimony about finding purpose in pain was healing hearts everywhere. What made Morgan's message so powerful wasn't just his famous voice. It was the raw honesty of his journey from faith to fury to redemption. When he spoke about losing Adina, about raging at God, about nearly walking away from everything he believed, people didn't hear a celebrity testimony. They heard their own stories reflected in his words. Countless letters poured in from people who said Morgan's transparency had saved their faith when they were ready to abandon it. The most remarkable change was in Morgan himself. His neurological condition continued to progress, but instead of seeing it as a limitation, he embraced it as a reminder to make every word count. His speeches became more deliberate, more measured, more powerful. He would often say, "God didn't take my voice away, He taught me how to use it with divine intention." Each carefully chosen word carried weight that his faster, healthier speech never had. Morgan never saw Samuel again, despite returning to that same sidewalk many times hoping for another encounter. But he didn't need to see him to know that their meeting had been orchestrated by divine hands. The timing was too perfect, the words too precise, the transformation too complete to be anything other than a miracle. Samuel had appeared exactly when Morgan needed him most and disappeared once his purpose was fulfilled. The letter that almost destroyed everything now sat framed in Morgan's home office, not as a monument to his near failure, but as a reminder of how close he had come to missing God's greatest assignment for his life. Visitors who saw it would ask about its significance, and Morgan would tell them the story of 5 words that changed everything. "She's still speaking through you." Adina's legacy had indeed found its voice through Morgan's transformed ministry. Every person helped through the foundation, every family guided through mental health struggles, every individual who found hope in Morgan's story, they were all extensions of Adina's continuing impact on the world. Her death hadn't ended her purpose. It had multiplied it exponentially through the man who loved her most. The most profound realization for Morgan was understanding that his suffering hadn't been punishment, it had been preparation. Every tear he shed, every prayer that seemed unanswered, every moment of spiritual agony had been equipping him with the experiential knowledge necessary to guide others through their own valleys of despair. His broken heart had been rebuilt into something strong enough to carry other people's pain. Morgan often reflected on how different the world would have been if he had sent that letter instead of meeting Samuel. Millions of people who found hope through his transformed testimony would have instead witnessed the spiritual destruction of someone they trusted. The ripple effect of that near disaster reminded him daily that divine timing isn't just about what happens, it's about what almost happens but doesn't. Today, when Morgan Freeman speaks about faith, hope, and finding purpose in pain, his words carry an authority that can only come from someone who has walked through the valley of spiritual death and emerged transformed. He has become living proof that God's greatest work often happens in our darkest moments, and that sometimes our most devastating losses become the foundation for our most meaningful victories. Samuel's 5 words continue to echo in Morgan's heart every day. "She's still speaking through you." And through Morgan's transformed life, Adina's voice has become a chorus of hope for anyone who has ever wondered if their pain has purpose, if their faith can survive their fury, and if God really does work all things together for good, even when it takes a homeless angel on a sidewalk to help us see it.